Hey, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you. Is the universe on our side? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so. To listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask more, better questions so that we might become more reachable as people. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. Have you ever heard the phrase, if everything matters, then nothing does? Doesn't that kind of feel like the times we're living in, where the constant bombardment of news from all points of the globe keeps us glued to our phones and TVs and computers, just chomping at the bit for the very latest thing to be enraged or impassioned about? And at some point, it just all blurs together, and you ask yourself, what is it I'm supposed to be concerned about again? Surely it's not just me. And then there's all the misdirection and all the sensationalism and all the straw man arguments. How I hate the straw man arguments. Let's say you send out a tweet that says something like, I just saw the total student debt in the United States has surpassed $1.8 billion recently. We have to find a way to solve the student debt crisis or our higher education system is in danger of collapsing. And then Rando Randy 3657884 replies, you just want to cancel all the debt and think we should just give away college degrees for free? This is America, not a socialist country. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Or how about this one? Make the passing comment in a conversation at dinner with coworkers that you are pro-life, and a colleague turns to you with a snarl and says, oh, so you're okay with men in authority telling women what to do with their bodies, huh? The straw man accusation. Yes, accusation seems like a better word here than argument. Turns any chance at a logical, reasoned conversation into a Civil War movie battle scene. Load the cannon with your strongest, most impenetrable opinion. Light the fuse, cover your head, and duck. Fire in the hole! My guest this week, Bruce Ledewitz, calls this debasement of discourse, this unseriousness to have uncomfortable conversations that is rampant within our society, as the Age of Evasion. In the Age of Evasion, irony replaces reason and passion replaces planning, and a lack of, or even complete, loss of faith. As a man who grew up religious who is now atheist, Bruce has a unique perspective on this loss of faith and what it has meant to our society. Yet interestingly enough, Bruce is hopeful. In his new book, The Universe is on Our Side, Restoring Faith in American Public Life, Bruce seeks to answer the question, is the universe on our side? To those of us who believe in a higher power, the answer is an easier one. But there needs to be a deliberate attempt to understand how and why others don't come to this same conclusion. And as for the answer for people like Bruce, who don't believe in God, he actually makes the case that even so, yes, the universe is on our side. And if the answer is yes, no matter where you stand on the topic of God, it has huge implications for our ability to overcome our lack of significance, trust, and faith. You write in the book, American public life is not really public life, but an imitation of public life. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think we all have this feeling when we watch the State of the Union address. We know that most of it's false, all of it's exaggerated. there's a performance where Democrats will applaud for a Democratic president, Republicans will not. Then there's a kind of a technique when the opposite party will applaud for something that the other party says but doesn't really want. I mean, the whole thing is staged in a very odd and artificial way. And I feel that way about almost everything. I can hardly ever watch any political event, even any public event in America today, because it's a script rather than any kind of genuine exchange. And I think if you look back at FDR, for example, in the 40s, of course, there's a certain amount of this always, but I think we've gotten to the point where we've lost touch with anything real at all. And it's all a kind of a made up play.
What has brought about this theater? Like, why do we find ourselves in this place where everything seems scripted? The characters are basically playing a part. Where did that come from?
Well, let me also mention one other example. My wife, who hated Donald Trump while he was president, and undoubtedly still does, she's a journalist, now retired. And we had to watch something on CNN, and it was talking about Trump. And she got up and she walked across the room. She didn't use a remote. She walked across the room and she turned off the set. And she looked at me and she said, "That's propaganda. That's not news." So as soon as Trump became president, the mainstream media began pumping out propaganda against him in the same way that Fox News pumped out propaganda against Obama. And, the same way we've been doing since Clinton was president. So that's another example of what I mean when I say American public life isn't real. When I actually have exchanges, not like this one, on a podcast, you can get a certain amount of sincerity. But when I have exchanges on radio, for example, and so forth, I have to remind myself, oh yeah, where are they coming from? Because that will determine everything about the conversation most of the time. So it's very, very strange to talk to people in public life. They really don't believe a lot of the things that they say. And sometimes they've gotten so used to saying things they don't believe that they've forgotten that they don't believe them. Anyway, you asked where it comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, of course, as you know from reading the book, I think it's from having lost touch with the real, with what is real. You have to be investigating reality in a very sincere way, trying to figure out things, the way things are, having some kind of touchstone with nature, with people, in a real sense, to keep touch with the real, and then that grounds you. And of course, since the death of God, this culture has lost most of its sense of the real.
And I certainly, obviously, want to get into what you just kind of dropped right there. But
yeah, right.
I want to continue down this because I have heard more recently than really any time in my life that America is an unserious nation. Is that what you're kind of getting at here? Is that we don't take the things that are important serious? It's performative.
Oh, absolutely. And there are a lot of really serious things going on. The pandemic is very serious, obviously. On the other hand, I remember during 2020 when I wrote the book, and it was during the lockdown. And you may remember that originally the lockdown was going to be for 2 weeks so that hospitals wouldn't become overwhelmed. And then the people on my side of the aisle, Democrats, liberals, sort of forgot that was the point of the lockdown. And it began to seem like the point of the lockdown was to prevent all infections, which was not possible and which was economically ruinous. And people just forgot that was the original point. And you couldn't say it anymore. Another example, and it sounds like I'm criticizing the left. Obviously, on the right, people talked as if there was no problem at all. There was no virus, But I'm sort of used to thinking of the right as disconnected from reality. And the shock was to see that everybody is, not just my political opponents, so to speak. And this book, as you also, I hope, know, this book can be read by both sides. It's not about our actual political life, although my own positions are clear enough. But the shock was to find out that everyone is actually that way. And to say it's unserious is absolutely accurate. And I think that we are simply unable to come up with answers to problems. The Democrats are a little better at trying to get answers to problems and a little better connected. But even the Democrats will pretend that deficits don't matter, for example, even in the middle of inflation, which just doesn't seem possible. I mean, I'm not an expert in anything. I'm a law professor, so I have to take advice from experts on everything. But it doesn't seem likely that you could just spend and borrow and it won't matter. I mean, when I read things like that, it just doesn't seem possible. And I read a lot of things that just don't seem possible. The Republicans told me that tax cuts pay for themselves. The Democrats tell me we can always borrow. And I wonder, why do we have taxes at all then?
That was my thinking the whole time is, how can you be surprised that there's inflation when you literally printed money, trillions of dollars over the last several years? Bruce, you've stated your position. You've stated, where you lie in terms of your political leanings, I guess you should say. But I will say in reading the book, you did an admirable job, if I can use that phrase, of outlining the ways that both sides, to use your language, evade seriousness. Mm-hmm. I want to ask you, how do you ground yourself? You talked about grounding yourself and putting yourself in the moment, which is what is real. How do you do that for yourself to where you can hold a critical eye towards everyone if it's necessary?
Right. And it sounds like I'm above the fray, which of course I'm not. I'm as subject to everything as everyone else.
We all are.
and when I say in the book, the way you ground yourself is to ask a question, a serious question. I learned that, of course, from my teacher, Robert Taylor, about whom I talk in the book, who has sort of taught me philosophy, the philosophical tradition, since I came to Duquesne Law School back in 1980. And he and I have been studying together. So I was very lucky to have a teacher who would help. Other people are grounded in many different ways. But the big ones, of course, are, on the one hand, religion, if it's sincere religion, and you accept its critiques. Another is science, of course, for many, many people. And you have to accept when it says no to you. But that's really the point. You have to be measuring your opinions against something that will sometimes not agree with you and be willing to be corrected. And how many people have changed their minds about anything in America in recent years? I mean, everyone is just sort of dug in. No matter what happens, there's a sort of explanation, and you never get correction. But of course, to be human means to be corrected. And unfortunately, postmodernism, which originated, of course, in the left-wing world, but it argued that everything was perspective. And that never made any sense. Not everything is perspective. There's a lot of perspectivalism, but not everything. There is actually something real at the bottom. And so people, very intelligent people, important people like Richard Rorty, for example, who said our language is not a mirror of nature. Well, yes, it is. I mean, to some extent, if you say, my friend is dead, that really, means something. It's not just a matter of opinion or perspective. And I thought it was funny. I had a cartoon in mind, the trans zombie, who says, I'm not going to be put in your box of alive or dead.
That perspectivism or that shift of believing your perspective is truth over the actual truth. I guess the question in all of this, Bruce, is like, how do we combat against that, that willingness to evade truth for feeling good about our perspective or our opinion?
Well, as I say in the book, the best thing to do is to ask a question, to start with a question. And in the book, I try to do that with Bernard Lonergan's great question. He's a theologian of the late 20th century, Canadian, but he asked the question that every secular person, he thought every human being had to ask this question, and that really every human being would ask this question. and that is the universe on our side? And now you can evade that question too. And I write in the book, right after after praising the idea of asking a question, I then ask, how can we avoid evading that question too? And I said, well, we won't. I started evading it as soon as I wrote that chapter. We try and we fail and we try again. The religious traditions have words for this. They have technologies for trying to get real and failing and then trying again. There are all kinds of teshuva in the Jewish tradition is what it's called, repentance. That's what that's about. It's about trying to get real and failing and then trying to get real again. That's what the religious traditions are trying to teach us. Now, we don't all have access to that. I don't any longer have access to that. So we have to try to find our secular alternative.
This question of does the universe or is the universe on our side? Why did it become so important to you to ask that question? Like what sprang all of this about for you, Bruce?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. Around the year 2000, I began to notice something really weird. And that is that every time I had a serious conversation with someone, could be someone in my family, someone at school, someone just out in the public, every time I had a serious conversation, it would always end up with that person saying to me, well, that's your opinion. And I just began to notice in 2000 that this was the way that people had begun to talk. And I knew they didn't mean it. I would say, do you mean slavery is a matter of opinion? It was just sort of one of those things, maybe good, maybe bad, and people don't really believe it. But after all these years of mechanistic materialism as the only ontology that we have, the only way we think things are what is real are forces and matter. Well, if forces and matter are the only things that are real, then everything is a matter of opinion in the world of values and norms and judgments. That just is what is. And people had gotten all fouled up in that ontology. Not that people knew it, but they became infected with it. The whole culture became infected with it. All the West became infected with it. And I only say the West because I don't know anything about the East and other cultures. But I suspect it's going to be true everywhere. I don't think there's going to be no one's going to be immune from this disease. Anyway, so that's what started this, was trying to figure out how that came about. Now, at the same time, I was going through I don't want to say a crisis. I knew this was coming. I no longer believed in God. And I had been raised in Orthodox Judaism at the New Haven Hebrew Day School. And I was very active in Congregation Dor Hadash, which you may have heard of. It was one of the congregations that was attacked in 2018 by a gunman here in Pittsburgh. And so, for me to leave Judaism was very, very hard, very difficult, took a long time. But I did finally feel I had to do so. And then I was adrift, just like the culture was adrift. I was acting out in my own life what the culture was going through. And I saw how hard it was. Very hard for everyone. And so I began to think, well, if we don't have God, how could we ground ourselves? And I made several different kinds of attempts in a series of books and came to Bernard Lonergan's question because I teach philosophy of law at Duquesne Law School. And we study Bernard Lonergan as part of our study every year. And I just, as I came back to him every year, I thought, well, he meant this to be our starting point. He foresaw that we would be in this state, and he was offering us a way out. And that's what started the work on the book directly. But it took several years.
Yeah. Bruce, you even write in the book that your book is for the non-believer, the person searching for the answer, and they don't find that answer in God. But I do want to go back to something that you made remarking about our faith in the West, which is, and I'm paraphrasing here, I believe you wrote something to the effect of, we have lost the faith that created the America that we knew, that we once knew, that created the founding of a country such as this, with democracy and liberal, little l, ideas, liberal democracy. How did we lose that? I mean, you're coming from a perspective of somebody who has left your faith and is now atheist, but I've got to ask that question as a man of faith myself, and I certainly see it too. I'd love your perspective on that more.
Well, we argue about, as part of our sides, we argue whether this is a Christian nation or was a Christian nation at the founding, or whether it was supposed to be secular at the founding. And we forget that they didn't have the hard categories that we do. When the founders wanted a secular society, they meant very specific things. They did not want clerics running society, and they did not want government to interfere in churches. That's what they meant. And they succeeded. That's the wall of separation. But the wall of separation was not for them ontological. That is, it wasn't a matter of whether God existed or what kind of God existed. It wasn't written. The document wasn't written by what we would call atheists. It was written in part by deists. It's true, but they didn't have any doubt that history had a shape. And if you wanted to summarize everything that was important at the founding, you would quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." There isn't a single founder who would have had the slightest disagreement or misunderstanding about that. There would be no hostility to that idea. And we certainly don't believe that. I actually track in the book a little bit, and I've done so since, all the people who write about that line, and almost every time in public life somebody mentions Dr. King's quote, they're embarrassed. They don't know what to make of it. They have to apologize for it, or like President Obama, they have to reinterpret it. President Obama famously said, "Well, yeah, if you bend it," but that's not what Dr. King meant. He meant, well, of course you have to be active and work at justice. I mean, I don't think anybody had to tell that to Dr. King. But no, he said it's not all in your hands. History has a shape sort of by itself. And we have to go along with that shape if we're going to live well and have a flourishing society at the personal level and at the social level. All the framers thought that. And if you don't think that, then you have to fight over power. And there can be no common ground, as you put it in this podcast.
You talk about our loss of faith in the future, our loss of hope and faith in the future. As you consider, and I'll kind of let the cat out of the bag, you do believe that the universe is on our side.
Right. And there's a funny story behind that.
Yeah.
I have to tell it.
Yeah,
because Cynthia Reed, my editor at Oxford, and I owe her a great deal of gratitude, because this idea had been making the rounds of the publishers for a couple of years without any success. But anyway, so I walked in to my meeting with Cynthia Reed, and they'd already accepted the book, but we were talking about the title. And I was in New York with my wife, Pat, and we were right before the pandemic hit, March 1st, 2020. And we sat down, and what I said was, "Is the universe on our side?" ? And she said, "I'm not publishing a book with a question mark in the title." And so that's how it became "The Universe is on Our Side." But you're in the book, I don't say you have to go along with me on that. I actually have a chapter, "What if you don't think that? Can we still have a flourishing civilization?" And the answer is yes, because you've gotten serious about the question. And now you're going to try to live in a world in which the universe is not on our side. And if that turns out to be the truth, it'll be depressing, but it'll be real. And you can certainly build a society out of that understanding. Absolutely, you can.
I'm curious, and you kind of touch on this in the book. If you answer no to the question, "Is the universe on our side?" then why even make an effort at all? If all of this is just we're space dust.
To be fair to the no, people like John Gray, great thinkers, or Carl Sagan in some of his moods, because he's not consistent. But I talk about the pale blue dot. The pale blue dot is sort of the way that the no manifests itself. When Voyager turns its cameras back, and you see the Earth is alone, the blue oasis in the blackness of space. We're all alone. No one will help us. We have to love each other. We have to care for the planet and love each other. And that's, that was what Carl Sagan was telling us. And that's how you build a healthy society in the midst of an uncaring universe. You say, we're an accident. Our hopes and dreams, our longing for truth and justice are not real, in the sense that the universe doesn't endorse it, but we endorse it. By some cosmic joke, we were made into beings who don't fit here. Nevertheless, these are the kind of beings we are, and we can live consistently with the kind of beings we are, even though we're out of step with everything else. That's how the no functions, or can function. I've been very disappointed that that the no, and what I hope the book will show is that you can really define secularism in terms of the yes and the no. And I think that both sides of that have not been very active. We haven't been working hard enough. We haven't understood our task to try to build a society out of the no or the yes. And eventually, I think secularism comes to a consensus. But in a way, we're at the point of the 3rd century in the church, where the nature of Christ had not yet been determined, been understood. And there were many different approaches to the nature of Christ. And the church had to hammer that out. Secularism over the next 100 years will have to hammer out the yes and the no. But both approaches can work.
Even that decision making, though, there is, even if somebody who is secular lumps themselves into the yes and the no, and then begins to make do with the work that is required there, you even point to the case of Democrats versus Democrats and Republicans. Once we choose, it's a passive choice. Once we choose our side, we just go along with whatever the party tells us to, and we don't really have to make choices about what we believe. It is just simply the other side is wrong, we are right. How do we bridge that gap, Bruce?
Well, now, because these are two different kinds of sides. If you're sincere, and this, of course, is Cosmopolis, you come up. All of your decisions. Cosmopolis was Lonergan's term for the question-asking community. He said in all the periods of decline, and Bernard Lonergan is like our perfect prophet, because he wrote about decline. What will happen when your intellectual and faith structures break down? Now, of course, he thought that in the end, God would show grace and would help, and we don't have that. But he described very well what we do have, and he says in all these periods of decline, you still have a question-asking community, and if you have to become a member of it. Now, you don't become a member of the question-asking community. You don't get a card. You don't, send your money in and join, but you're part of it, Michael. I mean, this podcast is part of the question asking community, and the question asking community comes to all of its conclusions lightly. They'd have to, if they were really asking questions. They'd have to know how hard it was for them to come to a conclusion. So if I'm in the yes, then I have to say I'm in the yes, but I know there's a lot of evidence for the no, and vice versa. And so you don't get the kind of locked in situation that you get with Democrat and Republican, which become symbols, titles, tribe names. The way that you get around that is to simply be willing. And, we have heroes who do that. Liz Cheney does it. She criticizes Trump. There's an example. I mean, we know what it means to be critical of our own side. We just find it convenient not to do so. And she deserves a great deal of credit for doing that. And what's funny is Democrats say that Republicans are in lockstep, but how many Democrats would do the same thing that Liz Cheney did if the shoe were on the other foot? I'm not sure so many. Mm-hmm. So the way that we get over that is by voting for people who will break with their party if they think the party is wrong. And people do that. People do that now. We just have to think about it more.
What are we afraid that we will lose if we do that? Because there's a zero-sum game mentality here, is there not? That if
Yes.
we do that, we're going to lose. What are we afraid of that we're going to lose?
And that's very important, Michael, because when Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long but it bends toward justice, he never had to win. He had to convert his opponent, but not defeat his opponent. He didn't think in those terms because the truth would benefit everybody. Now, if we have a zero-sum game, it's because we think there is no truth to convert anyone to. And we now lack faith in truth. Our own, even if we think we know what's going on and we think we're speaking truthfully, we no longer believe that truth has power. And that's where you see the whole First Amendment tradition in tatters. Because the First Amendment tradition, free speech, the whole point of it was that truth would emerge from unrestricted debate. And we don't think that's the case anymore. And I don't know why we don't think that. Because if you take something like climate change, which is very, very complicated and very slow moving and asks a lot of people, it asks you to give up something now for some benefit for your children and grandchildren. It's not easy. And it's easy to deny that it's going on. But you see movement there over time. People shift from saying it's not happening to it's happening, but we didn't cause it, to it's happening, we caused it, but it's too expensive to do anything about it. But it's not that people still say it's a hoax. The Republican Party does not still say that. That's evidence of the power of truth. It's a minor example because actually the truth of climate change is easy compared to the truth of the universe or more difficult normative judgments, but it still has happened.
I believe you write that though we deny truth is still just a drip of, it just keeps dripping out. We just keep getting a little bit more as we go along.
And that's right. And we said the Bush administration made fun of people who said, if you're not prepared, Iraq will be a disaster. And they said, well, you're part of the reality-based community or whatever that funny quote was. Well, yeah, but it actually did turn out to be a disaster. It turned out that reality community was correct.
On the side of the yes answer to the question of, is the universe on our side? What are the implications of saying yes for you?
Well, if you say yes, then of course, you can feel much more confidence. You're no longer in a zero-sum game. You're no longer the only game in town. Everything is not on your shoulders. You don't have to worry so much about losing because in the long run, the good is going to triumph. So you don't have to use dishonorable means to try to stay in power. You can actually say and mean it, this too shall pass. So having confidence in the future changes everything. That's the first thing that you get. Now, the second thing you get, though, is judgment. That is, the universe is on our side really means the universe is on a side, and we can align with that side, and it's good for us to do so. So now you have some standards to measure yourself and your society against, and you're not just making them up. And so you can say our society has to be based on cooperation, on compassion and generosity, or it will fail. Just like the Bible said. The Bible said, if you don't obey my law, the rains won't come. Well, now we know if we behave in a certain way, the climate will get wrecked. And the same thing is true, of course, for people. If we have a society that benefits only a few, that society will fail. That's just a sort of a law of history. And there are such things. So there's no point. You could say to the rich person, the billionaire, don't defeat social spending and higher taxes, because if you do, if you're successful, your children will suffer. That's the way it works. There's no point in your trying to hold on to all this power and money, because the universe works in a certain kind of way. And so arguments like that then make some sense, because you think there's something rather than nothing underneath it all. But that's how the society used to function, only it did so in a religious vein. There were great preachers who preached the truth of the gospel against existing power structures. And they've said, perfectly well that the Bible is true and our power structures are to some extent false. But it meant something then. And, but the same thing is true if the universe is on our side. You still have standards against which you can measure yourself, and you have to live according to those standards.
And what are those standards? That was where I was going to go next, is what does it look like for the universe to be on our side? What are those standards?
Well, right. And, I don't get into policy prescriptions, because it doesn't tell us what the tax rate ought to be. But it does tell us that we are not meant to be a permanent war, that people are fundamentally the same all over, that our first instinct should not be suspicion of the outsider, that there is no realm. I'll give you one example. There is no realm of the world, no human society that is unfit for democracy and unfit for limited government. That is a faith the framers had too. Because we are a certain kind of thing, a certain kind of being in a universe that functions in a certain kind of way. The basically healthy structures are basically healthy for everybody. And the bad structures, one-party rule, censorship, tyranny, these are bad for everybody. And that you get that out of the universe being on our side. That's a starting point. Sharing is a starting point. C.S. Lewis had a famous line in which he said, even if you don't think there is a God, that whoever structured the universe for people must have believed in taking your turn, because every society has the concept of taking your turn. And that's another, but that's a symbol for C.S. Lewis of justice, that there is such a thing as justice. Parents love their children. It's not some society, some culture, it's humans, and actually, certain forms of mammals, not just humans.
Yeah.
All of these become so deep and embedded that, suddenly you're in the real again, as opposed to making things up.
Certainly, I love the approach of the questioning, and this question is a huge question, but can you break down why this is not a question that we as a society have to address all in cooperation?
I'm not sure what you mean.
You write in the book that questioning happens at a small scale, but its effects happen at a large scale. Can you break that down? Because it would seem really heady for us as an American society to answer the question, is the universe on our side? That's not going to happen.
No, this is a very important point, Michael, because remember, Lonergan is writing out of an understanding that you're in decline. And the first thing you have to arrest is the decline. And so the first thing you have to do is become serious. And the way you become serious is by asking a question. But society doesn't ask a question, people do. So you and I ask the question and take the question seriously. And then the people who hear us begin to think about the question, and then they begin to take the question seriously, and it spreads. And so what spreads is asking a question. And that immediately, as it spreads, solves the problem of the unserious society. What I say in the book is asking the question itself solves the problem of chapter 6, which is the unserious society, but doesn't tell you the answer. Sort of the answer comes later, in which you begin to debate each other. Now, it may turn out, by the way, that I'm wrong about that. My experience so far since the book has come out, just recently come out because of supply chain issues, of course, like everything else. But what I found is the secular community that's organized is all in the no, in the answer no to the question. And they're really sort of hostile to the possibility of a yes. And so I wasn't anticipating in the book that the people who come to the conclusion no and the people who come to the conclusion yes would be in some kind of conflict. But it may be that I'm wrong about that. It may be that that this debate will not just be asking a question, but it actually will be arguing for a long time with each other. And that's okay. I mean, it's not a bad thing. I just didn't anticipate that that's what would happen. But now I think it is what will happen, because I think the no is much more firmly entrenched than I thought it was.
Can you address the gap between our need for significance and to feel like we're doing something worthwhile and the answer to that question of no? If our answer to the question is no, the universe is not on our side, where is the gap between that and feeling so insignificant, I got to imagine, and our need for worthwhileness and significance? How does somebody in that scenario bridge that gap?
Well, if you remember Tyson's second version of the Cosmos series, he was making fun at one point of our need for significance. And he said, we find significance in a piece of bread, which we imagine is the Virgin Mary, or some such thing, some silly thing that atheists like to say about religious people. But then later in the Cosmos series, he says, people do science because it matters what's true. So, there isn't anybody who doesn't think that what he's saying is important, or he wouldn't say it. And when you think that what you're saying is important, you don't mean it's important to me. You mean it's actually important in some ultimate sense. Now, the fact that I think that means that I have trouble taking the no seriously. That's my problem. I do. The person who argues vociferously that there is no God and it's just matter and forces and there's no truth really wants me to believe it because it's true. And I think, isn't that kind of self-contradictory? But what it really indicates is that when people live in the know, when they think that there are just forces in matter, then the human need for truth and significance is a kind of giant tragedy. We're a tragic figure, and we will see ourselves as a tragic figure, and we actually will get meaning from that. We will act out the tragedy. If you're in the know, you're acting out a cosmic tragedy, that there are these beings looking for permanent meaning in eternity, and they're going to be disappointed, and they're always going to be disappointed. But because of the kind of beings we are, we're always going to be looking for it, even though we know it's not there. And there's a kind of grandeur there. There's a kind of beauty there. And a society that firmly believes in the no is going to live right out of that tragic sense. It's not unhealthy. It's not impossible. It's hard. It's obviously hard, but it's not impossible. And so that's how you get meaning out of that viewpoint, I think.
Bruce, has your own interpretation of the meaning of life, or what has it changed since writing this book? In the process of writing the book, have your views or your own thoughts on your own significance changed?
No, they changed before I wrote the book. Okay. Writing the book was sort of confirmation. You probably know, because your book came out last year. The process of writing a book, and I wrote this during the pandemic, you have a chance to really get in touch with what you're thinking. And it's a wonderful experience if you have the time to do it. If you're writing on the run, it's not. But if you really are settled and writing and thinking, it's a beautiful existence. My problem came up earlier. I came to Duquesne coming out of a religious life, but I was having my doubts, and they gradually got worse and worse. And so I was in the no group, and I was thinking that how can we live and all the rest of it. But because I had been raised in Orthodox Judaism, I never could really quite abandon my childhood faith in the universe. And so finding Lonergan's question was like a life raft to me, because it made it possible again.
Bruce, big question here. What caused you, or what led up to you leaving behind your faith? Oh,
well, that's just science. It's really nothing more than that. It's not big. Supernaturalism is the problem. And for a long time, I thought, well, all the great theologians had problems with supernaturalism. And so, that's a kind of silly idea that you have, Bruce, that God is like some Superman in the sky turning tricks. That's not really God. And you have the God behind God that Luther talked about, for example. But the more that I tried to translate what went on in synagogue on Saturday, and the more I tried to translate what went on in the High Holy Days with this new understanding that no, God's just a symbol of something else, but it didn't work. It's not true. The Bible is really written from the perspective of a great creator God who loves humanity and has created things for humanity and does things for humanity and does things that interrupt the causal chains of nature. And that's part of the sign of God in the Bible, New and Old Testament. And so if that's impossible in principle, then you're in the wrong place. You're just in the wrong place. I'm not making an argument against it. God knows. See, I think people who are religious and have that faith are lucky. There is not one word in this book that in any way is an argument against belief in God. That's not what this book is about. And I would never do that, because I think that, for all I know, there is a God. I don't think so, but I can't, it's not a matter of proof. And by the way, some people who are in the religions, when they say they believe in God, they really mean the universe is on our side. Bernard Lonergan knew that. That's one way people express their belief in God. But in any event, I couldn't do it. And I was getting mad every week in synagogue. And finally, Robert Taylor said to me, your attitude of constant friction with what goes on in synagogue is the least religious attitude I've ever run into. Stop going. And he was right. And, it was bad for me. It was bad for everybody else.
I can attest, having read your book, it is not an argument against religion or faith. So for the listeners, I can certainly attest to that. But Bruce, help me bridge the gap here a little bit between, where is the common ground, I guess, that secular society and those who believe in God, where's the common ground on this question that we can, it may seem obvious, right? To you and me, having read your book and you having written it, but where's the common ground that we find? And how do we move forward?
First of all, if you are in the yes, then you're really close.
Yeah. Yes, you are.
There are religious people who will read this book and say this is nothing more than an argument about the nature of God. That's really what it is. That's all that it is. It's really a religious book. And if you listen to a show like NPR's On Being, you know that a lot of people who say that they don't believe in God and the people who do believe in God who are on that show, they often sound exactly the same. So if you're in the yes, as I am, you're sort of naturally close to religion. Now, if you're in the no, that's different. It's true. It's different. But the book is very clear about one thing. If God has died in the cultural sense, that it's not a matter of there are not millions of believers, sincere believers, there are, but God has died in the sense that God no longer runs the culture. That is, the sense of God is no longer operative at the level of public life. Well, then there is no point in kicking that dead horse. And the people on my side, the secularists who are in the know, have to stop attacking religion because it's irrelevant to the future of this society. They think it's irrelevant to the future of this society. There is absolutely no reason for the hostility that secularists have. It's absolutely true that there's a war on religion. I mean, it's not when religious believers feel that there's hostility against religion, they're absolutely right. And people like my friends, my secular friends who want to deny that this is the case, there's no war against religion. That's not true, because people who are in the know in answering this question write as if, or people like Sam Harris write as if religion is superstition and there's no reason in it. That's not the case. That's ignorance. And the religious believer has reasons for what the religious believer believes. So what I say in the book is secularists may be very close to religion or they may be very far from religion, but they have no bone to pick with religion. There's absolutely no advantage in having this argument about God and religion. It doesn't change any kind of public policy. And a secular person has no right to be critical of the beliefs of religious people. That's the kind of invasion of conscience that the framers hated. The framers of the Constitution hated that kind of society. They knew those kinds of societies, and they did not want to be part of them. And so to attack religion is mostly that. It's attacking what people believe and their matters of conscience and making fun of the idea of God, which isn't most religions' idea of God. So in any event, there could be some policy disagreements, of course, but things like religious exemptions from ongoing acceptance of same-sex marriage. I'm disappointed in some of our religions for opposing things like same-sex marriage, but they do. And if you think that the universe is a certain kind of thing, and it's all forces in matter, and God is dead, you can actually be generous, grant religious exemptions, knowing that this opposition is going to fade away over time because it's not grounded in anything. So the people who are in the know should have the least problem with religion. They should not consider it a serious matter, after all. But anyway, that has to be heard from within my group. That can't be said by religious people to secularists. It has to be said within secularism. But that's part of the message that I intend to carry.
It's a fascinating perspective that you don't hear very much, Bruce. That's just what was going through my head as you were saying that. You write in the book that we are heedless to give offense and I believe quick to take offense. How do we not give or take offense in this conversation and asking this question? Are there things that we can do to protect ourselves from offense?
Yeah, well, it's actually very easy. If I'm sitting down with you and we're asking a question, I sat down with John Snyder on American Free Thought, for example, a couple of weeks ago in his podcast, and John's firmly in the know and thinks, I'm sort of nuts, if I put it bluntly. But we had a wonderful conversation because he's a serious guy, and so we're arguing the evidence. If you're engaged in a project like this, you're arguing the evidence. You're not getting offended. You're looking. And, John's looking at one thing, I'm looking at another, and he says, well, look at this. And I say, well, look at that. And there's nothing to be offended about because we're trying to find the answer. And so when you're engaged in asking a real question, offense doesn't come up. Offense comes up when you're not engaged in asking a question, when everything is shadow boxing. then of course you're offended. It's that somebody's gone off script. There isn't any script when you're asking a question.
I love that. You brought us right back around full circle. I love that. Bruce, what is a question that you wish you were asked more?
Oh, I wish I were asked the question, how do you build secular civilization? And the reason I wish I were asked that question is because that's the next question. And we don't have an answer. I spent the summer, part of my job this summer was to build an audience for the book. And I utterly failed. It's very hard to do in America, to break in when you're not already known. So one of the things that Holly Watson, my excellent publicist, told me to do was to get articles planted. So, in magazines. So I spent the summer, one thing I tried to do this summer was to plant an article on how to raise a secular child. And I really thought people would be interested in that. Turns out they're not interested in it very much. But that's what we're going to have to learn to do. And we don't have the slightest idea how to raise a secular child. The closest we've ever come to understanding how to raise a secular child, I mean, in a healthy way. What people do now in raising their kids is, to a certain extent, they cheat. I'm really lucky that when my kids were growing up, I was still firmly within Judaism, although I was having my doubts. But I was sort of the last generation in my family that could really be in that tradition. And now everybody has to sort of scramble and figure out what to do. And you grab a little of this and you grab a little of that. It doesn't work. You can't grab a little of something. That's not how kids think. Kids really want a story. And you have to decide what your story is. And we don't know how to tell secular kids a story. The closest anybody's come is The Lion King, Disney's movie, and The Great Circle of Life. That's the closest we've come. And when the Great Circle of Life story is told in the movie, the kid lion says, wait a minute, but we eat the antelope. And the father says, well, yes, but let me explain. So, I mean, it's very difficult to tell a secular story of life. And that's what we have to learn how to do. So that's, anyway, a long way of saying, I wish we were talking more about that.
If the death of God from a cultural standpoint, as you referenced earlier, if that is a lot of the cause of a lot of our issues, should raising a secular society be the goal?
It's not a goal.
Okay.
No, Michael, it's not a goal.
Please
it's
explain.
What you're stuck with.
Yeah.
It's not that you are trying to keep people from believing in God. Let's say it turns out it's not possible. There's never been a secular civilization after all. Let's say it's not possible. And people say, sit down one day in the future. I'll be gone. You might still be around. People sit down in the future and say, you know what? We've been trying for 20 years to build a secular society. It's not working. Maybe God exists after all. And God was just sort of trying to show us that God exists by giving us our head. That's Bonhoeffer's idea, teaching us to do without him. And since it didn't work, it will have us turn back to God. Maybe that's what will happen. I don't know. But at the moment, we're trying to build a secular civilization because we are secular and we don't have a civilization. So it's not that it's a goal, it's a necessity.
I appreciate the clarification, Bruce. Thank you so much for your time today. Where can people connect with you and follow up on your work?
Well, I have a website, bruceledewitz.com. I'm easy to find. You just Google me or the book or the book. I'm very accessible. I answer questions on email all the time. And if I hope people will buy the book, read it, and send me questions, ask me questions, have me come and talk either on Zoom or in person. This is my work. I'm still a law professor at Duquesne, but the university is extremely generous and very invested in the book and the work, and very supportive. So I will go where there are people who want to talk about these things.
Well, thank you for talking about it here for the last hour. I appreciate it, Bruce. Best wishes to you and your work.
And have a very Merry Christmas, Michael.
Thank you. That's a wrap on episode 73 of the Follow-Up Question podcast. So many thanks to Bruce for sharing his wisdom and perspective and ideas on the show this week. Please do me and Bruce a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to today's conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the incredible guests that I have on each episode, like Bruce Ledewitz, subscribe so that you never miss an episode. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to michaelashford.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question, and until then, keep asking questions.